Hey everyone, I thought I would go ahead and do one last final little short, hopefully, video lecture for you guys as we wrap up the semester. And here we are in the very last module with your final program evaluation project papers due just around the corner. Everybody should have received feedback on their drafts, and I appreciate the hard work that you guys put into them and getting them to me in a timely manner so that I could get you that feedback. If you have any other questions about it, feel free to ask before you submit them. I'm going to open up the Dropbox for those final papers shortly after I open up this course module, so that if you want to turn them in and submit them prior to the due date, which is, what's the due date that I have on that? The 8th of December, right? Yes, the 8th of December is when those papers are due. You can certainly turn them in earlier, and I'll just start grading them as I can. As I mentioned in other classes, I'm rounding up the last couple of weeks of a pregnancy here, and so I'm hoping that I can be the one to be grading all of your papers. That's my intent. You know, we'll see how that goes. But I should be, hopefully, fingers crossed, the one grading your papers as we wrap up the semester. So there's a lot of stuff in this last module, right? And my apologies for cramming a lot of this stuff in. And I know that within the program evaluation project, if you're looking at the rubric, you're following the outline, I did not include a specific area where I want you to tell me in a more dedicated manner about how you might address biases or how you might address cultural differences or diversity within your program evaluation project. Although we did have a discussion post about that. I don't know why I put it in another week's module. But I did, you know, but I think it's important to take the time as we are coming to a conclusion in the semester and your understanding of research and introduction to research and program evaluation, that bias and culture are in every single aspect of counseling research that you can imagine, from the very onset of when we are thinking about beginning a research project or implementing some type of program within a counseling setting, when we are starting out conducting a needs assessment. We have to be actively reflecting on our own personal bias. What is drawing us to do the research that we're doing, what is drawing us to study the population that we're studying, what is connecting us to the interventions that we're using within that population, within that research project. So from the very onset, we have to be aware of and actively examining and reflecting on our biases. We have to be aware of the cultural influences that we have to take into consideration when we are recruiting participants, when we are determining who's going to be on our team, our research team, when we are developing products and materials to give to participants, when we're picking out instruments and developing surveys. We have to be aware of all of these things. So at every single stage that we are going through in the research process and in the program evaluation process, we have to be acknowledging the role of bias and the role of culture. And if we fail to do that, then you know, I leave you with the question of, can you really generalize your findings to the broader population? And so kind of historically, in thinking about the future of research and counseling, you know, historically, you know, we did not take into consideration bias. We did not take into consideration culture whenever we were looking at populations to be studied, when we were developing instrumentation, when we were reviewing assessments and coming and drawing conclusions about working with specific populations of individuals. Really, to be blunt about it, we were just kind of looking at you know, such a heterogeneous population of individuals, and we were conducting research in the counseling profession, that we were leaving out massive populations of individuals that come from minority backgrounds and statuses. You know, even, and we find that even when we're looking at like research and rehabilitation counseling, which is interesting, always interesting to me, because, you know, diversity, there's a ton of diversity within disability populations in general, right? But disability as a minority population is the largest minority population in the world, because you know, if we're looking at just disability. And so for rehab counselors to not address you know, disability plus all of the other identity categories within the research that had been conducted and continues to be conducted in rehab counseling, generally would do a disservice to the work that we're trying to do as rehab counselors. So when we're looking at bias, you know, there's bias within the work that we're proposing and presenting. There's bias within, you know, how we're selecting our research team, how we're selecting assessments, how we are evaluating assessments. And then there's also bias that can come through on the part of our participants, which we have to factor in as well. So we have to acknowledge that we have to acknowledge who the population is that we're studying. And so thinking about how a lot of research is conducted on students, let's say at a university, you know, you have to think about who those students are and what type of individuals go to post-secondary education. And, you know, are we limiting the scope of how we can generalize our results simply by way of the population that we're choosing to usually for matters of convenience, to study our you know, or form a hypothesis around. So, and then you have to think about how participants are motivated to engage in those studies or to engage in a program like a counseling program intervention that you're putting into place. Is there some type of intrinsic motivation that we're not taking into account? How are we asking them to complete surveys? You know, if it's a self-report, then we have to take into consideration that social desirability factor, that even when we as researchers say to our participants, everything's going to be confidential, I'm not going to track you, it doesn't matter how you answer, please answer honestly and openly, you know, people still want to reflect the best person that they can be, and that is especially true if we're looking at research survey items or interview type questions that are those more difficult, self-reflective, you know, who am I as a person, what biases do I hold, type of questions. And you know, I'll give an example. So my doctoral dissertation was on social justice competence, okay? And so I was surveying counselor supervisors to see what really they were looking for when they were going out and hiring new counselors. You know, what qualities were they looking for in terms of social justice competence? What did those supervisors want their new clinicians, new counselors to be aware of? And so at first I thought, well, easy peasy. I'm just going to go out and give a survey that I'm developing to a bunch of counselor supervisors and they're going to fill it out. Not a big deal. So whenever I was considering questions to ask on those survey items, right, and taking into consideration the demographic categories that I wanted to include in my survey that I developed on my own. So I had to think, well, do I want to ask every single state? No, I want to break it into regions. What regions do I want to break it into? How do I find out the information? What have other people done in the past? I do want to know something about gender, but you know, gender identity right now is fluid, and so how do I really capture that without feeling that I'm leaving somebody out? So maybe I should leave an open-ended question, which I did, and which I got a lot of different answers back to, and then had to figure out how am I going to categorize all of these different answers and perspectives. When I wanted to look at age range, I had to be able to reflect on why I was asking about somebody's age. Why did that matter in the greater scheme of things? For me, it mattered because I wanted to also know what type of graduate program somebody came from. And so if somebody reported that they were kind of in that older bracket of age, as most supervisors might, because supervisors generally aren't like the 23-year-olds that just graduated, right? And so I would link up, you know, the older populations that maybe did not come from a core K-CREP accredited program because quite possibly they didn't have to come from a core K-CREP accredited program back in the day. And so just within the development of the demographic section of the survey that I put out for my dissertation, a lot of time and effort went into considering how questions were going to be asked, how participants could report responses, and then how I was going to analyze those responses when it came time to do that. And that was just like 10 simple demographic questions that had nothing to do with the rest of the survey. And so when you're really taking the time and effort to focus on bias, you have to take it from every different perspective. My apologies, children are here as I'm recording this video, so it is what it is. And the same goes for cultural influences and cultural implications as well. I had to make sure that the survey items that I did ask, so I did a kind of a type of factual analysis, and so I had to make sure that if survey questions needed to be translated, that they could easily be translated. I had to make sure that if survey items, whenever I developed my survey, it was a relatively long survey because it needed to be. But whenever I developed that survey and I ran it past a focus group of individuals, I was asking them, do these questions make sense to you? Or is it just me that they're making sense to because I'm ingrained in this world of understanding social justice competence? So from the perspective of a researcher and the bias that comes through, we often get really tied. I've said this before in this class, we get tied to our ideas, and that can be limiting. And that extends even further out. The text talks about how, I think I put an article in here about, bias that comes into play when grants are being reviewed, when publishers are reviewing work for potential publication. And so, we find that if my ideas don't jive with my colleague or counterpart, I'm probably not going to be as willing to accept their results, whatever they may or may not have been. An example of this that I can give from my work, again, around my dissertation, my dissertation chair, the individual that kind of was at the head of my dissertation committee, still is a Catholic priest from Mauritius, which is a tiny little tropical island off the coast of Africa. And so he, because I was talking about social justice competence, felt very strongly that I should incorporate a spirituality aspect to my literature review and potentially the survey that I was asking as well, because kind of his thought process behind that was that a lot of the foundations in social justice and counseling parallel that golden rule that applies within different religious sects and specifically within Catholicism. So at first I was very resistant to do this because I didn't want to tie in religion, honestly, to my overall review of literature. But then I had to take a step back and acknowledge that, this would add some value to the greater perspective that I'm presenting in my dissertation. If I really want to make sure that I am acknowledging all the different frameworks around social justice competence, then me leaving out religion as a potential framework would be doing a disservice to the readers and to myself and my understanding of social justice competence in the broadest sense. So I don't know where I was going with that. So that's just another example of where, working with colleagues, you have to be careful because you're oftentimes just trying to find like-minded people to be working with, whether it's in research or whether it's in program evaluation. So that everybody's kind of on the same page. It makes it easier if everybody on a team is on the same page, right? But it is useful to have differing perspectives come into play. Other things to consider, kind of how the program or the research that you've designed, how that might limit populations of individuals that could be participating in the program, how it might, again, limit the demographics to a certain extent. An example that I can give kind of from real life around program evaluation is within the grant that Dr. Glenn and I are working on with our team of individuals. and the use of virtual simulation and virtual reality. Now we have to, because it's a federal grant, obviously, and because we should be doing this, acknowledge any areas where accessibility might be an issue. Accessibility to individuals with different disabilities, right? And so part of what we've had to do is acknowledge that individuals who have hearing impairments, individuals who are deaf, individuals with vision impairments may not get the same experience in our program as individuals that don't have the same limitations in terms of sensory impairments. And so with that also becomes there has always been a need to address, accommodations that could be made. Can we provide things in text that might otherwise be provided verbally? Can and how are we going to be using interpreters? And what effect would that have on the experience of our participant? So if we're using a virtual reality environment and Oculus Pro, which is like cool little virtual reality goggles. And so the question we've had to ask ourselves as a program evaluation team is, what kind of impact would that have on somebody with a vision impairment? Or can we really, again, have somebody who is deaf using the Oculus and engaging in the social virtual reality environment with an interpreter there, getting the same type of content information and getting the same type of experience as other individuals. And so we've had to be very reflective around that and dig a little bit deeper to find out if it's even an option to have those accommodations put into place for our participants. And so then kind of the bigger picture or the down the road kind of issue will be when we do have a participant that has a disability that we've made an accommodation for, how will we capture that whenever we are reporting findings to our stakeholders, to the government, and publishing results? And so all of that has to be taken into consideration. So hopefully that gives you kind of an example of, from start to finish, how we constantly, as researchers in counseling and as clinicians who may be putting into place different programs, have to address bias, have to address culture, and different ways in which we can do that. So I think that kind of wraps everything up. We've had a review of what's left in the semester. My kids had a meltdown, and I kept it short and sweet for you guys. So with that, I will leave you to